From trying to survive horrifying wars, to the early rise of the internet, down to creating cringe TikTok slang. I will be explaining every generation in human history from the oldest generation to the youngest generation. We're breaking down the unique traits, trends, and milestones of each generation. Watch till the end of the video to find out what generation was the best, or perhaps the worst generation to be alive in. The Lost Generation, 1883 to 1900. Living in this generation is a horrifying nightmare because World War I was in full swing. People who lived in this generation were dodging missiles and bombs. The trauma that came with this generation was unimaginable. Over 8.5 million people died in the war, and 21 million people were injured. As if losing friends and family wasn't enough trauma for these guys, this generation also experienced the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 that wiped out 50 million people globally. All these constant losses led this generation into the early beginnings of the Great Depression, which consisted of a high rate of unemployment and abject poverty, which eventually resulted in a general sense of hopelessness. But let's look on the bright side. This generation surprisingly created great minds that made significant impact in the world, like Albert Einstein, who developed the theory of relativity, and Ernest Hemingway, who, despite being a little grumpy about the world, gave us some of the best novels ever written. The Greatest Generation, 1901 to 1927. These guys had it a lot harder because the world just finished a war, which led to the Great Depression that crashed the stock market. The economy took a crazy downward spiral. The unemployment rate was as high as 25%, and a total of 12 million people were jobless. This led to people losing their homes and savings, which led to widespread homelessness and poverty. But guess what? It got more depressingly worse. They were hit with World War II, and this time the war was even deadlier than the previous war. 60 million people were killed. After the war, the remaining survivors found a renewed appreciation for peace and love after witnessing the worst in humanity. They started rebuilding the economy again, with notable figures like Alan Turing, who pioneered computer science and artificial intelligence. The Silent Generation, 1928 to 1945. Ever wondered why your grandparents are strict and disciplined? Well, it might be because they grew up as the Silent Generation, where the after effects of World War II and the Great Depression shaped their entire lives. If you grew up in this generation, you would develop a tough personality to be unfazed through thick and thin situations. This generation is often like the quiet kid in the back of the class who grows up to be a secret genius. They didn't make a big fuss about their struggles. They just got on with it, worked hard, and built up the world they wanted for their kids. They were called silent, not because they were shy, but because they were more about action than protest. They were the generation that really showed you could thrive without having to be flashy about it. Baby Boomers, 1946 to 1964. The baby boomer generation exploded onto the scene right after World War II. This generation is called the baby boomers because they were born in a period that saw an unprecedented number of births. With so many babies, it was like they took the passage from the Bible where God said, "Go forth into the world and multiply," a little too seriously. The boomers were the first generation to experience true suburban life. Large families and the power of television witnessed the moon landing, and they were the ones who saw the rise of rock and roll, with Elvis Presley shaking things up, just like we have TikTok challenges now. Think of them as the pioneers of the YOLO mindset, except their version was more like, let's work hard, then throw an epic party. In their eyes, they invented freedom. They questioned authorities, protested the Vietnam War, and were at the forefront of women's liberation and also fought for civil rights. They were indeed the superheroes of social change. Generation X, 1965 to 1980, the generation with the coolest name. But Generation X, unlike the X-Men, were not superheroes unless you consider growing up without the internet and a smartphone a superpower. They were the first generation to grow up with divorced parents, MTV, and the original Star Wars trilogy. This generation was called the Latchkey Kids because of their independent traits. They saw their parents working hard while they learned to stay home alone and avoid getting in trouble. They grew up self-reliant and adaptable. This generation witnessed the rise of the cooperate ladder, but were the OGs of the work-life balance concept. They worked hard and played harder, and they were the original side hustlers juggling multiple jobs and gigs. This generation gave us men like Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, Steve Jobs, founder of Apple, and Jeffrey Bezos, the founder of Amazon. Millennials, 1981 to 1996. Millennials, or Generation Y, are the people who were born in the rise of the internet, smartphones, and social media. If you were born in this generation, you have lived through it all, from dial-up internet, flip phones, and smartphones, and you're still waiting for those promised flying cars, right? But, in all seriousness, millennials are very versatile and ever ready to take on the next big thing. Millennials are also highly educated because their parents often encourage them to enter college. But unfortunately, they entered the job market during the Great Recession. They're often accused of being lazy and entitled, but honestly, they're just trying to pay off student loans larger than the GDP of small countries. They are the generation in the sweet spot, not too old and not too young. In summary, millennials are a generation of adaptation that has navigated the shift from analog to digital, from traditional values to progressive ideals, and from stable careers to the gig economy. Generation Z, 1997 to 2012. Imagine a generation that grew up with Wi-Fi in their pockets, internet culture in their hearts, and a very low tolerance for nonsense. Yep, that's Gen Z. They're the digital gurus who understand memes better than maths. If you're Gen Z, you can probably communicate more effectively in emojis than in words. This generation is so tech-savvy to the core that if you showed them a VHS tape or a rotary phone, they would probably look at it like it's an alien artifact because they grew up in an age where voice assistants, touchscreens, and constant internet connections were the norms. Gen Zs have never known a world without Google, and social media is a way of life to this generation because they live and breathe platforms like Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and Snapchat. Ultimately, Gen Zs are very socially conscious and intelligent because they care about social justice, mental health, and animal safety. They're also the generation of social media hustle, internet gigs, and entrepreneurial vibes. This generation created guys like Mr. Beast, iShowSpeed, and loads more who created an empire through social media. They've got big dreams and they're not afraid to fight for them. But they'll do it with an aesthetically pleasing Instagram post. Generation Alpha, 2013 to 2025. And here comes Generation Alpha, the Zoomers in the making. The first generation to be born entirely in the 21st century. They might still be figuring out how to walk, but already know how to use an iPad. Technology is not just a tool for this generation, but also an extension of themselves. These kids are going to be the ones who invent new ways to interact with technology, like controlling their smart homes just by thinking. They'll grow up with smart toys, AI assistants, virtual reality classrooms, and a world that's more connected than ever. They've got their whole lives ahead of them. But for now, they're busy watching Cocomelon on repeat and probably learning to code before they're out of diapers. They'll be the most diverse, tech-savvy, and socially aware generation yet.